You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 28th of August, 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Is Israel opening a new front on the West Bank? Is a new trans-Pacific policing plan a rebuke to China, even if everyone says it isn't? And should space be allowed to become a billionaire's playground? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests John Everard and Patricia Cohen will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll speak to New Yorker staff writer Jonathan Blitzer about his new book, taking a close look at the reality of the United States southern border. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by John Everard, former UK ambassador to Belarus, Uruguay and North Korea, and by Patricia Cohen, global economics correspondent at the New York Times. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Patricia, first of all, you have recently been visiting a hotbed of British culture, and in so doing, seeking to learn something about British culture.
Well, I think that's really putting too much of an educational spin on it. But I was at the Fringe Festival in Edinburgh, which I've been to before, and I absolutely love. It's just kind of buzzing with, creativity and culture and theater and fun. So, but I did get an introduction to three British comedians, apparently, who are very famous, but that I had never heard of. But I thought it was hilarious.
Are you going to sort of provoke incredulous guffawing from our British listeners by naming the three British comedians you'd never heard of?
You mean Tommy Cooper, Eric Morecambe?
Yep.
And I'm embarrassed to say I forgot the third one.
Bob Monkhouse, as we were discussing in the waiting room.
Yes, exactly.
No,
it was delightful. It was really delightful.
You recommend this production if it comes to a place near our listeners?
Oh, yes, absolutely. It's called The Last Laugh. So I'll give them a free plug because it was really delightful.
John, I'm trying to contrive a seamless overlap between Patricia's venture to the Edinburgh Fringe and your recent visit to Istanbul, something about rooms full of excitable eccentrics shouting in small rooms in front of tiny crowds,
yes.
that kind of thing.
The rooms actually were quite big, and they were very full of very excited, very voluble Russians and Chinese who were at it was a conference organised by left-wing Koreans in Istanbul, who clearly, I think the polite phrase is they see things differently. I think, put it more bluntly, I'd say that I realised on arrival that I'd been transported to a parallel universe where all evil comes from the United States of America, which has contrived to make human misery.
For our listeners, he's pointing at me.
Yeah.
And where sacred Russia, holy Russia, is simply recovering its territory in Ukraine, which isn't a real country at all, where Kim Jong-un is cuddly, fluffy, lovable, and doesn't mean any harm to anybody. Those nukes are just kind of bling. And where world poverty is simply a result of the evil machinations of Washington, D.C. The trouble is these people actually believe this rubbish, and they build policy on it. It's quite scary.
John, regular listeners to our programme, and indeed regular listeners to that disquisition just then, will be aware that this is not necessarily reflective of your views. Why did they invite you? I mean, did they just not read anything you'd ever written or listen to anything you'd ever said, or do they actually have, for their manifold other vices, quite a progressive approach to plurality of opinion?
Tokenism. They were short of Europeans. So they went through the list of possible European commentators.
You sure it was that kind of tokenism, or they were thinking, we do need some non-insane people?
No. I don't think there was any great demand for non-insane people there. They all seemed quite happily insane together. No, I think it was just a mistake. And when I sort of said the things I tend to say, given a rostrum and a microphone, there were sharp intakes of breath, and two of the Russians walked out. So I thought I got something right somewhere.
But as long as you didn't actually get tarred and feathered and heaved into the bottom Bosphorus. That's still like a pleasant city to visit.
Oh, wonderful place, yes. And you did realise, wandering round the palaces, the former sultans, just how much Vladimir Putin has learned from the Ottoman predecessors.
Well, we will have more from both of you shortly, but first, it is a reasonable assumption that many of the people who recently elected Sir Keir Starmer's Labour Party to govern the UK were hoping for a slightly more adult relationship with Europe after 8 years of the Conservative Party eating itself alive over which faction could fear, resent or loathe Europe the most. Today seems like a promising start. Starmer visiting Germany for talks with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz to discuss a new cooperation agreement between the two countries. I'm joined now by Carsten Nickel, Managing Director at Teneo, the global consultancy and risk advisory firm. Carsten, first of all, the cooperation agreement, did we hear much in the way of specifics of what this is likely to entail?
Well, the cooperation agreement is obviously something that they will be negotiating over the coming weeks and months, right? The goal is to finish this early next year. But I think we can, based on the conversation between both sides over the last couple of weeks, we can already see where this is going. And I think it's safe to say that the focus will be very much on security and defense cooperation. And that obviously has to do with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with the changes in German foreign policy as a result of that, and of course with great concerns all over Europe, right, regarding the outcome of the American election later this year. So I think security and defense will be the absolute focus of this.
All of which does, of course, seem logical enough, all things considered. But it was nevertheless telling, I thought, that Starmer thought it necessary, even engaging with Germany at this, fairly everyday sort of level, to make it clear that he wasn't talking about reversing Brexit.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, in his defense, I think he has a point here, because from his side, of course, the big prize from the British perspective is to gain something like, let's say, closer access, better access again to the European single market, of course, without joining it, without rejoining the customs union and the single market. So how do you get that done? I think the big problem for him here is that someone like Scholz might be sympathetic to Starmer's new government and to the UK attempts to move closer to Europe again. But obviously on these economic questions, Germany can't decide on its own, right? Because it does that together with all the other EU members in Brussels. And I think that ties his hands somehow. So I think basically with Starmer ruling out a return to the EU, what he's basically saying is I think he's preparing himself for what he knows comes next. And that is that the Europeans will make certain requests, such as, for instance, a youth mobility scheme, which would increase freedom of movement again.
Which Starmer has so far sounded pretty unenthused about, but is all of this kind of positioning leading up to 2026? Incredible to think that Brexit was 8 years ago. It does seem closer to 800, but that there will be a review of the Brexit trade deal. Is Starmer hoping that the EU might be a little more flexible with him if he is a little more flexible with them?
That is definitely the hope, yes. And I think there is the bigger hope behind that the geopolitical context, looking at the US, looking at Russia, Ukraine, looking at China, also helps with that, and perhaps makes the Europeans a bit more open, let's say, towards striking perhaps somewhat more pragmatic deals. Because if you look at the reality of, let's say, British electoral geography, right, the places where Sir Keir Starmer won his landslide majority, many of these constituencies are outside London, have lower shares of college-educated voters. In the end, we're talking about an electorate that's probably not as pro-European as some of the Labour core strongholds here in London, right? And I think that is definitely something that Starmer needs to pay attention to.
It was noticeable that as he conducted that campaign and won that majority, that he, as far as it was possible, he did not utter the B word during the campaign unless he absolutely couldn't avoid it. It's probably a little early to start wondering if that's going to change. He can barely have finished unpacking, but do you think he might start acknowledging a bit more frequently and a bit more flagrantly the damage that Brexit has done, and maybe try to start a conversation about how we undo some of that?
Yes and no. I think for tactical reasons, if I was him, I precisely wouldn't acknowledge the damage just because that topic was so divisive, right? And we all know how the 2019 election went for Labour when Brexit still divided the country so much. So the less you have to talk about that, the better. But then at the same time, I fully agree with you. When it comes to the practicalities of politics, yes, the goal must be to move Britain closer again to the EU, because in the end, and Starmer made that very clear in his press conference in Berlin again today, right? His prime objective is growth for Britain. If he wants that, moving closer to the single market again is definitely something that he will work for.
So just finally, Carsten, do you think we should anticipate more of this kind of outreach from Starmer, making, a fairly concerted and obvious effort to go and visit Europe's capitals, to be photographed with European leaders in, collegiate tones?
Yes, and talking with them, right? And talking with business executives and representatives of civil society. He's obviously doing the right thing. From Berlin, he's flying straight to Paris to talk with Emmanuel Macron again. I think this will be his 4th or 5th visit to Paris, really in a very short time span. So definitely, I'm pretty sure that we're going to see more of that, yes.
Carsten Nicol at Teneo, thanks for joining us. We'll bring our panel back in now, Patricia Cohen and John Everard, and we'll look at the Middle East and potentially ominous indications of a new front in Israel's near 11-month war with Hamas. Today's IDF raids across the West Bank may be the most substantial such operation since the Second Intifada and follow last night's airstrike on what Israel claimed was a terrorist command centre near Tulkarm. At least 9 Palestinians have been reported killed today in Tulkarm, Jenin, Nablus and Tubas. According to Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz, these were raids against Iran-linked Islamist terrorists. Katz further suggested that Gaza-style evacuations of Palestinian civilians might be in order. Patricia, first of all, hard to say this may be an isolated thing. It may be the beginning of something, but does this look to you like it might be a biggish deal?
I think it's a very big deal, although it's kind of every day brings more worrisome news about how the situation is evolving in the Middle East. We had bombing in Lebanon recently, although that does seem to have been contained somewhat. But, this is really, in the heart of the West Bank. And you've got settlers living there in very close proximity, growing numbers to Palestinians. The death toll is going up. I think it's near 600 by this point, just in the West Bank.
Important to emphasise that this
Bank
is
alone.
Far from the first action on the West Bank in the last 10 months or 11 months or so.
Right. And so any escalation, the other thing that I find very troubling are the comments both from the ministers and the cabinet talking about how this, hopefully will make it even more difficult to ever create a Palestinian state. And it's definitely being seen as a potential land grab by the Israelis who have been occupying the territory since 1967. So I do think it's a very troubling development.
John, is it possible that the fact that Israel has got away with what it's done in Gaza to the extent that it has encouraged certainly some of the more excitable elements in the governing coalition to think that they can get away with more or less anything?
I think that's possible. Certainly some of the statements coming out of some of the more wild-eyed members of the coalition suggest that is what they're thinking. And they will have been further encouraged by the fact that, despite this massive incursion, the Iranian reaction has been very muted. Of course, it condemned Israel, but no suggestion yet that there's going to be any kind of kinetic response. So, it may be they're going to be proved right. That Israel can get away with these things.
Patricia, this current episode of Monocle Radio's The Foreign Desk, if you'll all forgive the crashing plug, does discuss to a degree the extent to which the United States' patience with Israel has dwindled since last October 7th. Would we expect it to dwindle further, perhaps to some sort of crucially low level if, as Israel Katz has telegraphed, they did start instructing civilian populations on the West Bank to flee their homes and go to some vaguely specified safe area?
I mean, I think it's very difficult to figure out exactly where the U.S. is coming out on things, particularly, you're in the height of the presidential campaign season. And so what is number one on the Biden administration's mind, as well as the Trump campaign, is how to attract as many votes as possible. And obviously you're dealing with identity politics in the U.S., and there's been a lot of focus on anti-Semitism in Congress. There's been hearings. At the same time, there's been a lot of disaffection from the Democratic Party because of its support of Israel and its unwillingness to really detach itself and to still provide weapons. So I think it's really unclear what exactly the U.S. is going to do. I will say that history has shown that very few presidents, if any, Bush briefly, who opposed the expansion of settlements in the West Bank, has ever really gone up against the Israeli government.
John, but looking at the perhaps narrower regional responses to any such development, it was noticeable that when Iran launched that vast, if somewhat slow and ungainly airborne armada against Israel, I think in April, among the allies who scrambled jets to shoot it all down was Jordan. If Israel starts throwing its weight around on the West Bank to the extent that Palestinians start leaving their homes, the obvious place for Palestinians to go is Jordan. It's not like Gaza where people have nowhere else to go. That could conceivably test Jordan's patience somewhat, couldn't it?
I think that's a wonderful understatement, yes. I was talking about this with a Jordanian diplomat just a few weeks ago, and when I mentioned the possibility of large numbers of Palestinians coming to settle temporarily, of course, comrade, in Jordan, he became really quite irate and animated. I think if that ever happened, the Jordanian government would have a major sense of humour failure, and Israeli-Jordanian relations would be very heavily strained.
One other development in this realm in the last couple of days, Patricia, is that Palestine is proposing to join BRICS, this informal alliance that originally constituted, if I've remembered them all right, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. I think I've got that. It seems to be understood that Palestine will be accepted to, I don't even know what to call BRICS, whether it's really an organisation or anything at all, but nonetheless, as and when that happens, does that make any difference to anything?
I think the issue of Palestine coming up at all at the BRICS meeting says much more about the changing global order and shifting power politics than it does about the prospects of a Palestinian state or not. I mean, what this is really about, is, as you said, when you said the members, Russia and China, who are also, the two biggest adversaries of the United States. Mm-hmm. And what we have been witnessing for the past couple of years, and we're going to keep on witnessing in the coming years, is essentially a kind of reshuffling of the global order as there's more challenges to American dominance, and Russia and China have their own agendas in that. And so I think what you're seeing here with BRICS, which is also talking about a vast expansion to let a lot of other countries in, is looking for a kind of organizational counterweight against the United States and Western Europe, which are clearly the countries that dominate the international system now in most of the institutions. And by inviting the Palestinians in, what they're doing is really making a gesture that's very meaningful to a lot of people who support Palestine and say, like, hey, we're in your camp. The United States is not.
John, if we look at this from Russia's and China's perspective, then, I mean, are they animated at all by pure-hearted concern for the well-being of the Palestinian people, or is this, as Patricia says, does it strike them, as frankly the Palestinians have often been since 1948, a convenient means of winding up the United States?
If this were a face-to-face conversation, I'd attempt to guffaw, but I think the microphone might sort of misrepresent that. No, China sort of tender-hearted concern for the Palestinians Palestinian people, hey, if only. Russia, likewise. No, China's objective in BRICS has been to get what it loves to call the global south to ventriloquize China's concerns. The trouble is that the opposite is happening, that the global south more broadly has been sitting on China as it faces this very serious economic situation. I see that they've issued another 400 billion in bonds today to ventriloquize its concerns, which wasn't what Beijing wanted. Russia, too, clearly wants to use BRICS as a lever to undermine the US-based international order. The trouble with BRICS is it's become so broad as to become almost meaningless. Brazil and India quite emphatically do not want to upset the Great Order. They want perhaps a different place within it, but broadly they're satisfied with the status quo. If it grows further, if Thailand, if Malaysia come on board, then you're going to get something like a miniature version of the United Nations General Assembly. You can talk about issues till the cows come home, but the chances of reaching any kind of useful agreement in BRICS start to become vanishingly small. And the introduction of Palestine means that from here on, these long-suffering people are condemned to discuss the Palestinian question every time they meet. It's going to get tedious.
Well, let's look at one particular part of the global south, and it is amazing when you think about it that more palm-fronded tropical locales with pleasant climates and agreeable beaches don't stage their own diplomatic/security organisations with attendant wingdings. It's not like anybody would need asking twice to turn up. And if anybody from the Pacific Islands Forum is listening, this broadcaster is available to host interviews and moderate panels. Reasonable rates inquire within. At the current such gathering in the Tongan capital of Nuku'alofa, leaders of various Pacific nations have agreed with Australia a framework for a new multinational police unit to respond to natural disasters or what were euphemistically described as security challenges. John, the money for this is coming largely from Australia, 400 million Australian dollars in funding. Is this a quite expensive way of hanging up a big sign for the benefit of China saying back off?
Not just for the benefit of China. I mean, everybody's focused on the fact that China is excluded from this. So, of course, is the United States. And so, indeed, is everybody who isn't part of the region. I don't think the sign would say, China, back off. I think it would say, this is our area. We will look after ourselves. Thank you very much. And I, for one, don't find that objectionable. I think it's good that the Pacific countries should be able to get together and jointly solve their problems.
Patricia, I'll ask you a variation of the same question. Anthony Albanese, Australia's Prime Minister, was very careful to say this isn't about any other country. Do we entirely believe him?
Well, I think in this sense, I would say it's, I agree with John, and also that it's a continuation of the point that I was making before about BRICS, that this is, again, another sign of just how the international order is changing, how a lot of countries are jockeying for better position and power in all of this. And certainly China's interest, that has become a security concern, and China has definitely looked to extend its dominance in the region. But I agree, it's what we're seeing is this kind of vast, reshuffling going on, and a period that accompanies that of a lot of instability, which is what we're also seeing.
How much rejoicing will there have been at this announcement in China, though, John?
Hard to say. I think, firstly, the Chinese tend to see everything, in terms of just how it affects them, and they will, regardless of what Australia might say, think that this is just another anti-China act, that everybody's ganging up on China. On the other hand, China is starting to run out of cash for these things. I mean, the Chinese economic situation is getting very, very bad. The Great Belt and Road Initiative, the last great meeting they had on it, showed that the disbursements, even on the flagship project for foreign aid, was down by 90%. So having local countries in the Pacific area look after their own security without expensive inputs from China might not be entirely unwelcome in certain sectors of Beijing.
Yeah, Patricia, nevertheless, would the United States not consider this a minor strategic win, perhaps, but a strategic win nonetheless? Because if Australia is asserting itself more as a regional leader in the Pacific, then, at one remove, that's the United States. acquiring influence.
Yes, I agree. And I think Washington is probably happy about this development. And my guess would be behind closed doors has certainly encouraged it.
What do you make of the agreement itself, though, John? Because it does appear to be fairly relaxed in terms of its strictures. Countries seem to be able to opt in or out as they see fit.
Well, yes, that's right. That was probably deliberately so. That it gives the countries flexibility. They will be able to opt in when they face real problems and opt out when they face fewer problems. I mean, in practice, that's the way a lot of international organisations work, even though it doesn't say that in the rule book. I don't see a problem with that.
Well, let's move along. And finally, there is, well, not entirely finally, but finally for the purposes of our panel, there is obviously a lot you can do with $1 billion and even more you can do with several $1 billion. It is noteworthy, however, that a noticeable proportion of those who have that kind of cash seem preoccupied with launching themselves into space. Jared Isaacman, founder of Shift4 Payments and of private Air Force concern Draken, is, as of this recording, shortly due to lift off aboard the Polaris Dawn mission of SpaceX, itself the plaything of a billionaire who has thus far, and greatly to widespread regret, resisted the temptation to launch himself into orbit. Indeed, why stop there? Isaacman hopes to become the first ever privateer spacewalker. John, first of all, I'm assuming by the fact that you're sitting here that you don't have several $1 billion lying about, but if you did, would you be spending any of it on launching yourself into space?
No, I won't go into deep detail about what I might spend $1 billion on, but space launches probably wouldn't figure very high up the list. That said, I think we have to recognise that Jared Isaacman is engaging not just in space tourism. There's genuine research going on here.
This is true.
He is going to attempt a spacewalk. Without an airlock. So you open the capsule door, you let all the air out of your capsule, having remembered first to put your spacesuits on, and two of the crew will then go and attempt a spacewalk with just a simple umbilical cord between them and the capsule, while the other two, I suppose, watch in awe as they perform this great feat. The spacesuits are new and largely untested. I mean, they've been tested to destruction, of course, on Earth, but never in space. So this requires a certain amount of courage. He is actually pushing out margins, and I think we have to recognise that.
See, Patricia, I don't think I can say for certain that I would not do something like this if I had a couple of $1 billion lying around. The tragic reality is that I have barely half that. But I do also wonder whether having an amount of money, which, let's be serious, is vastly more that you could spend in several lifetimes, really, that you just get kind of bored with being able to think, I can have literally anything I want. So what's something that is really, really out there?
I mean, I have two reactions to this, and one is kind of the wonder and awe that we all have about space and the idea of going up in a space capsule and the extraordinary expanse of the universe out there. And so, I mean, and obviously that has always been an attraction. On the other hand, I have just a revulsion at the idea that people have so much money that they literally don't know what to do with it. And that, we have a society where you can have a very small handful of individuals who are able to control so much of the planet's wealth and resources in a way that they see fit, and obviously we were just talking about the problems of 5 countries even getting anything accomplished, let alone any kind of, world agreement. But it underneath this, which I know is a much less kind of sexy topic, though, is just the inequality that I think it shows up, and just how so few people are able to command that many resources and put them in a way that they think is best, for ill or for worse. But it's a very anti-democratic ideal in a lot of ways.
Well, indeed, and obviously the furniture of the rocket that will bear Isaacman aloft, it has been delayed by various hitches. Recently spent $44 billion, John, to buy a social media platform on which to make an idiot of himself, not realising perhaps that the entire premise of that social media platform is that you can do that for absolutely nothing. But you sort sort of alluded very darkly to what you may or may not do with $1 billion. But if you think about it seriously, where do you think the gulf is between what you like to think you would do with that kind of money and what you would actually do with it if you had it?
I think that the gulf is enormous. I mean, the nearest parallel I can think of this, I was in China in the 1970s, just after the Cultural Revolution, when China was dirt poor, and the Chinese were fascinated by wealth. And Chinese after Chinese, came and sat with me and said, if I had money like you Westerners, and out would come this great list of philanthropic projects that they would engage in, send all their children to the very best schools and end poverty in China and build something wonderful, their native village. Of course, when China got rich, they spent their money on just the same as everybody else. None of this actually happened.
Well, they did send their children to the most expensive schools in the United States.
Yes.
That is certainly true. I actually have to say, I have thought about this a lot, like what kind of billionaire I would be. And I do believe I would be uncorrupted. And I'm happy to, anybody who would like to test me on that and give me the resources for it, I'm happy to take you up on that offer.
And if anybody does take you up on that offer, Patricia, I will be expecting a commission. Patricia Cohen and John Everard, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, if there is any one thing that both sides agree on approaching November's US presidential election, it is that there is a crisis at the United States southern border with Mexico. Our next guest has done what so many professional bloviators have not and gone to take a look. Jonathan Blitzer, a staff writer at The New Yorker, has reported extensively from the border region and distilled what he has discovered into a new book, Everyone Who Is Gone Is Here, The United States, Central America, and the Making of a Crisis. I spoke to Jonathan earlier and began by asking if there actually is a crisis or whether people just make political hay from calling it that.
Well, people definitely benefit from describing it as a crisis. And I think, to my mind, having spent a lot of time on the ground with actual people who are in real states of direness, who have left their homes because they need to leave their homes, I've always felt ambivalent about the word crisis because obviously it has a political valence and a political spin to it that is very much intended to stoke fears, confusion, to kind of undersell the degree to which many aspects of these issues at the border are fixable or at least addressable. So, on the one hand, I've become quite suspicious of the word. On the other, it is a real humanitarian crisis. I mean, there's no reason to sugarcoat it other than to try to shield yourself from just the terrible politics of it all. I mean, what's happened over the last several years is large numbers of people have left their homes. For most of the years that I was focused in on this, it was people coming from Central America where they were fleeing very real and existential things, gang violence, kind of strangling corruption, political persecution in some cases, extreme poverty, all of these things that really forced people to uproot themselves against their will. And they were arriving in larger numbers than the U.S. government was able to address because the U.S. government has to hear people's asylum claims by law. Someone fleeing persecution, seeking protection in the United States has the legal right to seek asylum. And so there is a crisis insofar as large numbers of people were fleeing something or another, and the U.S. government didn't really have the administrative means or the political will to work out the mechanics of how to provide people an opportunity to seek protection. So to my mind, that is a crisis. What's unfortunate is, of course, the fear-mongering, particularly on one side of the political ledger here, tends to spin the messiness of that situation on the ground into a political talking point, which, leads toward hostility to immigrants, confusion about what our legal responsibility is to people arriving at the border, and so on.
I mean, this is the thing that often happens, I think, when a particular thing is happening to a very large number of people, and there are clearly very large numbers of people trying to cross that border. You've done that thing which is it's a trick seems the wrong word. It's what journalists do because it works. You tell the big story by finding a few much smaller stories and making people remember that this is all actually happening to actual people. This is what you've done in your book, but I'm wondering, of all the stories you you could have chosen from. What drew you to the people who kind of serve as your case studies?
The through line in each of their stories is that their personal experiences over the last several decades really illustrate the degree to which the United States, and in this particular case, Central America, are deeply interconnected. And they're interconnected as a result of all kinds of things, which I try to describe in the book. Most importantly, American foreign policy in the region through the 1980s created the first of these ongoing waves of movements of people leaving their homes in the region and coming to the United States. And the lives of the figures in this book illustrate that in a very immediate, visceral way. But then they also, each of them has, in many ways, kind of embodied this broader history at every moment. And so, as you can imagine, the 1980s have a kind of distinct plot line. The 1990s have a distinct plot line. The early 2000s have a plot line all their own, and so on. And these people, at each stage of those unfolding stories, kind of lived in a very direct way all of these bigger forces. American foreign policy, American immigration policy, Central American political developments, generalized violence in the region, things like, for example, the rise of these really murderous street gangs in Central America. That was the result of U.S. deportation policy in the 1980s, which had its origins in foreign policy entanglements in the 80s. And so you start to see all of the ways in which these stories are intertwined. And so if there was sort of one general takeaway, I was hoping, a reader, say, would have experiencing these stories and getting to know some of the actual people who've lived them, is that the policy and the politics around things like immigration they're so basic and they're so reductive. And they're actually, in many ways, if you really think about it, there's a kind of cynicism behind how, political leaders now talk about these issues. They talk about these issues as though we don't know any of the backstory. And so my hope is that at least there's a sense of humility and awareness that people take away, seeing all of the factors involved.
Is it your feeling, and this is, I think, mine, when I'm trying to be optimistic, that what gets people anxious and unhappy about immigration, it's not actually immigration, but it is, as you say, the perception that nobody's watching the shop, that this is just a free-for-all, there is no system, there is no order. I think when people think that there is some sort of organisation, that does take a lot of the edge off the argument.
I think that's right. What's happened here is the immigration conversation, which is a huge conversation and concerns really every facet of American life, gets hijacked by the situation at the border. I mean, the situation at the border is it's obviously the most sort of visible daily reminder of the immigration issue generally. But, if you really look at the immigration system as a whole, the asylum system, in other words, the actual mechanics of people showing up at the border and seeking protection, that's a small slice of the overall legal immigration system, which has to be updated. I mean, it's madness to basically only ever point to the border and not address the fact that, of course, unless we modernize the immigration system generally, there are going to be people who have no choice but to show up at the border and try to gain entry that way. And so the last time the U.S. reformed its immigration system in any kind of meaningful way was 1990, just as that kind of benchmark. And so there are, if you can kind of at least de-dramatize a little bit this sense of disorder at the southern border, you can start to, in theory, I'm not terribly optimistic about the American conversation on this, but in theory, you could begin to at least have a more level-headed adult conversation about the system writ large. The United States economy would not have rebounded from COVID, for instance, had it not been for immigrant labor. That's a basic fact. You have economists at the Federal Reserve publishing papers demonstrating this. You have cities and towns and states all across the country here with severe labor shortages. This stuff is, this is sort of a basic economic fact of life. If the United States wants to continue to grow, if its economy is going to continue to grow and function in a basic way, there needs to be, immigrant labor. There needs to be an openness toward the idea of immigration generally. But you're right. What happens is the conversation always just boils right back down to the border. And it's a trap because, there isn't a clear answer for dealing with arrivals at the border, and there's no silver bullet solution. And so everything else in the meantime is kind of frozen by a preoccupation with the border.
That was Jonathan Blitzer, staff writer at The New Yorker. His new book is Everyone Who Is Gone Is Here, The United States, Central America and the Making of a Crisis, and it's very much recommended. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, John Everard and Patricia Cohen. Thanks also to Carsten Nickel at the top of the show. Today's show was produced by Hassan Anderson and researched by Sana Jumani. Our sound engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.